it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. So there's effort behind this. So hopefully
is.
people are enjoying. I think people are enjoying it. We're getting reached out by different parties interested in collaborating and stuff like
nice.
that. So
Cool.
so this next guests are one of them. They're the producers of Mid-Americana, Midwest podcast. They're one of them is a professor at Central College. They both work at Central College. They got this idea to get this podcast project, but it's an extremely interesting approach to podcasting as far as diving into the changing of the Midwest and how it has changed. For example, since '95, since we've been here, we moved here because of the meatpacking plant. And when we were in school, it was just in Perry, just a few kids, right? And then now Perry is like almost 50% Latino.
Yeah, also known as
That's
Little
cool.
Mexico.
Nobody knows.
Yeah, people call it that.
Really?
Yeah, I
Well,
feel
Marshalltown is also one of those. Tama, Denison. So their first season was, they spoke with people that left Iowa and came back to Iowa years later.
And they were like, what the fuck?
Well, they gave their perspective on, growing up in Iowa. They left, for whatever reason, school or whatever, and then they came back. And then the second season that they have is on immigrants. But it's not just Iowa, actually. Like, one of them is in Minnesota. It's actually extremely well put podcast.
Nice.
Much better job than what we do.
Oh, okay.
They put music. There's narrative.
Fuck you.
Fuck you. No. I'm a fan, actually. I listened to a lot of their episodes on first season and on the second season. The second season is a little bit more impactful because it's immigrants, but it's not just Latino immigrants. They pick from different.
Right.
I think there's a Filipino. There's an English, somebody from London that moved here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so they're very.
You don't see that a lot.
Yeah,
I don't see that a lot.
and then one from Minnesota that she's from a small island. But yeah, it's very educational, very well put together, good production, good music. There's narrative on top of it. It reminds me to NPR like pieces.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Nice.
So, I want to thank Brian Campbell and Joshua Dolezal for making time for us, and obviously inviting people to go and check out Mid-Americana podcast. It's literally just Mid-Americana.
Okay. And where can we find it?
It's on their website.
And what's the website?
That's it, Mid-Americana
okay.
podcast. Yeah, if you Google it,
Let's go.
we'll put some links. But how you been? How everything good?
Good. Let's go.
Let's go. All right, here we go. Episode Mid-Americana. Episode Mid-Americana podcast. We'll just call them what it is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, by the way. I appreciate it. So, Brian Campbell and Joshua Dolezal. Did I pronounce that right?
That's fine.
Okay. So you host Mid-Americana. You produce a podcast series. You're on your second season. My first question to you is how did this project came about? How did this start? Joshua.
We're all like Iowans at a four-way stop sign. Now you go first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Amner, for having us on your show. And we've been fans of yours as well. So it's an honor to be here. Yeah, I think Brian has the most expertise in the area of oral history. That's something he can maybe speak to as part of his dissertation. But, we started talking about this as a class that we could team teach. Oral History of the Family Farm, I think was the name of that course that we taught together. And we just sort of dangled it, the podcast version as an option. So students could either do interviews and then write papers, or they could sort of teach themselves Audacity software and do a podcast. And some of them chose that option and they did a great job. And we got kind of inspired by that. And I had a sabbatical coming up and we thought, this would be a good sabbatical project to try to launch a podcast series. Maybe Brian can add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, so both of us were teaching at Central College, and we're both from other parts of the country originally. We're not native to Iowa, and so we were excited about having our students do these kind of interviews, get to know real Iowans, not just learn about agriculture in textbooks or lectures, but go out and talk to real people, which is something that, like Josh said, I'd been doing in my own research and teaching, is, doing interviews, gathering people's stories. And yeah, I think after that experience of teaching together, and we decided to think about doing a podcast with that sort of focus, looking at the culture of Iowa, the culture of the Midwest, how this region is changing, some of the things we see as people who've settled here. So yeah, that's what inspired us, is just kind of people who are learning to love Iowa and the Midwest, and seeing all the things about this region that are maybe more than the caricature that you sometimes hear about. And so that's kind of what got us started. And that first season, we did a whole series of stories of people who were native Iowans who'd moved away and lived in other places, and kind of what their take was as people who'd moved back to the Midwest. And then we are just finishing up our second season, which is stories of immigrants. So people who grew up in other countries, other places, and have migrated to the Midwest. And we have some Iowa stories still, but we've also got stories from lots of other parts of the region.
So, Brian, what is, so when you start something, it evolves into something else. I mean, I did listen to a few of your first season podcasts. You talked to Mike Draper, the founder of Ray Gun, and Don Oropesa. That was a beautiful podcast. How her soul almost like came out of that. So that really touched me. That podcast that you guys did with her. How has this project evolved into, now you're on season 2, immigration? Is it what you thought it was going to be?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it definitely has. I think it's definitely evolved too. So, we've learned a ton about the kind of technical side of podcasting. I'm sure you're, familiar with that, and other people you're working with on podcasts, so we've had to get better at sound quality and some of those things. We're lucky to have some funding. We have a grant from Humanities Iowa that's helped us to get some good recording equipment and get some support from a professional sound engineer. So that's been really fun to learn, and we've been able to teach students and some other professors how to do more podcasting and do better sound quality. I mean, one thing that's definitely evolved, we had been really excited about doing all of these face-to-face and, traveling to go visit people. And of course, COVID kind of changed that plan. So we've, in some ways, I think that's allowed us to have a different reach, and to more easily collect those stories and think about the connections across the Midwest. But yeah, I think in terms of the stories, I think we had some ideas about the kind of people we'd want to talk to, but that, I think, has been the most exciting evolution, is just being able to meet new people. Podcasting is such a great way to have a window into people's lives, and people are really gracious about sharing their stories. And so I don't think we had any idea, where this would go exactly and the kind of people we've met, but it's been really fun for me to meet new people who have ended up, been important connections way beyond just that couple hours of chatting with them. But, once you've heard their stories, they become friends, colleagues, collaborators in all sorts of new ways.
One thing I would add to that is, as Brian says, the pandemic has changed our ability to sit face to face with someone, and that's opened a wider range. we can more easily do an interview with somebody in Minneapolis, or on shorter notice you can kind of set up conversations farther away. But the other thing I didn't really anticipate, but in hindsight I should have, is that the change in theme makes it more difficult, I think, to find people willing to tell their story. So the first season featured native Iowans who left the Midwest and came back to stay, and a lot of them, as you said, were entrepreneurs or activists, or doing something that they were happy to promote on a podcast. In the immigration series, it's a more private kind of story, often with a lot of pain and trauma built into it. If someone is a refugee, that's the reason they immigrated, then not everyone wants to tell that story publicly. And so I think that was a challenge I didn't really see coming as clearly as I should have, that just asking the question, will you tell your life story, for the whole world to listen to? It's not always so simple.
How did you go about specifically on this second season, which is immigration? That's the how did you go about finding your subjects? What was the criteria? I mean, they had to be immigrants, and then what else?
Well, we use a kind of formula for our interview plans, and we think of it in terms of chapters, because we do want this to be a story podcast, not just an interview podcast. And the distinction is, an interview podcast is more facts and information.
Mm-hmm.
A story podcast might involve an interview form, but then we use narration and we stitch together something that's more like a literary narrative, at least as we perceive it. So chapter 1 would be origins to, birth to the point of departure. So for a lot of people that might be childhood, or it might be up to teenage years, if they're living in a refugee camp till they're 16, as Hem Rizal was. He was a refugee from Bhutan who grew up in a refugee camp in Nepal. So that would be chapter 1. Chapter 2 might be the immigration story, whether it's the flight, just all the new experiences in that journey. Maybe there were different stops along the way. A flight landed in a city, and then the family was relocated somewhere else. It might also include early days getting settled. So Kao Kalia Young, a Hmong writer from Minnesota, based in Minnesota, her immigration chapter was partly including the housing project where her family settled in St. Paul initially. Chapter 4 is making a home in the Midwest, so overcoming racism or xenophobia, just those early challenges of getting established in this new place, figuring out what it is. And then chapter 4 is what we think of as the changing Midwest. How are folks contributing now to what we call the changing Midwest? So we wanted stories that fit kind of all 4 of those chapters, and some of that was referrals from friends. We did some Googling, of course. So some folks are authors, or Dominique Sarand is a theater producer based in Minneapolis. I found him by Googling immigration stories from Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I just add, I think you mentioned our first season, we wanted to talk about native Iowans, but we also wanted to complicate the cliche of what that includes. So somebody like Don Martinez or Peza, whose family, are Latino Iowans who've been here for generations, way longer than I have as a white Iowan. So I think we wanted to complicate the kinds of stories that we included in that first season, but also with these stories of immigration. So, we've included the more common kind of categories of people that people think of, so like I talked with Jean-Paul Cheson Cardenas, who grew up in Guatemala. There's obviously lots of Central American immigrants in Iowa that I've enjoyed being around, but also lots of smaller communities. So I'm just finishing up an episode with Irene Ernest, who's from the Marshall Islands, which is a tiny archipelago of islands. She's technically not an immigrant because they're have this special relationship with the U.S. because of the history of nuclear testing there. So she's not an immigrant. She's not a refugee. She's not undocumented. So just kind of complicating those categories and including the stories of, some of the larger, better known groups of immigrants in the Midwest. And, we have the stories of Somali refugee in the Twin Cities. There's lots of Somalis in Minnesota, but we also have these smaller communities like the story of, these Pacific Islanders in Dubuque, Iowa. So yeah, I think we wanted to try to have a whole mix of different voices. It's been fun, kind of getting to know new people and networking and finding those stories as we go.
So as interviewers or as podcasters, we are kind of we get the first kind of, we're the first audience to this conversation, right? We hear it first. So we are touched in whatever way, positive or negative or educated or not. Wait, how have you been surprised about anything that you've done in these last 2 seasons that you didn't know about Iowa or the Midwest? Is there anything in particular that pops into your head that you're like, this I didn't know, or this caught me off guard, or I've learned this?
Well, I can say I didn't know anything really about the Hmong population in the Midwest, and so I didn't know anything about Bhutan really either. So with a lot of these stories, just having the conversation, we do 2-hour interviews and then cut it down under an hour. Mm-hmm. So just sitting with someone for 2 hours and hearing their story, trying to do more listening than talking,
right,
has taught me a lot. And I think for some folks, the Midwest as a destination, as a place of opportunity, as a completely positive kind of environment, took me by surprise, because I brought, and I think Brian did too, some prejudice against the region with me. I'm from Montana, from the Mountain West, kind of West Coast Association. And so all I could see when I came to Iowa was there was no mountains, And so hearing from other people what they appreciated about Iowa as a new home place, was meaningful to me. The other thing I'll add is we were kind of motivated, as Brian said, by this flyover country insult, that you get from East Coast, West Coast, that there's nothing in Iowa or the Midwest that's worth anything or culturally significant. And Mike Draper plays with that sort of thing, that everywhere in the Midwest is the gateway to the West. It's the way to somewhere else. But that was really something all of our guests on season 1 had something invested in. They wanted to push back against that and took it personally. But our guests in season 2 don't have anything invested in the Midwest stereotype. They don't feel like they need to defend the region against its bland reputation or whatever. So that was an interesting perspective for me, that for him, Rizal, the Midwest is the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation where he taught with Teach for America. The Midwest is Nepali immigrants in Des Moines. That's what it means to him. And so he doesn't feel like he needs to defend white Midwesterners who were upset by how New Yorkers perceive them,
I did.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, the episode I just did have been working on, that's the last one of season 2. So this is an interview, like I said, with Irene Ernest. She lives in Dubuque, Iowa. She grew up in, this part of the world that's one of the most polluted places on earth. There's nuclear testing in the 1950s from the US, and now these islands are the most vulnerable place on the planet in terms of sea level rise and climate change. And so I was curious, because we've had so much flooding in Iowa, related to climate change. I was curious, like, what is it like to move from a country that's got these risks and now live in a place where there might be flooding here? So that's my sort of projection as somebody who works on environmental issues in Iowa. And this is definitely one where, I kind of had a narrative in mind. And from her perspective, it's like, this is so much safer of a place to live than an island where you can have like tidal waves that
right,
completely inundate everything. And so I think those are the kind of things that I appreciate, as you said, about, being that first audience and just getting um, somebody who's willing to correct me and check me on the kind of
Like
ideas I have in my head,
world problems, right?
first world problems. It's like, flooding here, we have like all these resources
Yeah.
and, it's nothing like growing up in a tiny island country.
I did listen to the Mike Draper episode that you did, and the more I hear Mike talk, the more I gain respect for him. He's very intellectual. He's very articulate with his, thoughts, and he. That's the episode that I saw Iowa in a different way. So, what do you expect for your audience to walk away with on each episode? Because you do, there's production in it, there's music, you narrate, and you let the person kind of showcase themselves in their thought process. What do you want the audience to walk away with, Josh?
Well, I suppose I want every episode to include some element of surprise. You know, um, for Zoe Buras, she came to the United States at age 10 from the United Kingdom. Her mother met a man in an online book forum, and then ended up they got married. And Zoe grew up in Illinois and thinks of herself now as a Midwesterner. But I think for a lot of her childhood, thought of herself as a Brit. You know, she was European, but then she studied in Peru, and everybody saw her as a gringa and then as an American.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of an interesting twist, on her identity. Um, or she went back to Oxford University for her master's program around the time that Donald Trump was elected president, and then everybody thought she knew why people voted for Trump and had some special insight. So she was again seen as an American, even though she was coming back to the place of her birth. So I like those surprises. Some of them are really devastating surprises. Kaukalia Young has a section from her latest book, Somewhere in the Unknown World, which is a collection of refugee stories or refugee memoir, where her kids ask her how she met her father, and the short version is that he came to one of her readings, and, they had lunch together, and that's kind of how they met. But the long version is that he was born in I think a Milwaukee suburb, and she was born in a refugee camp, and that there was no way that anyone could fathom how their lives would intersect. I didn't know anything about how the Hmong were involved in the Vietnam War, or that for Hmong people, the Vietnam War is still not really over. So some of those surprises are kind of funny, and some of them are just gut punching and brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose I want listeners to be open to being surprised, and maybe changing the way they see not just the region, but maybe American history too.
Brian, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Both of us have a background as teachers, and so I do think we want people to learn something. I think there's so much about the Midwest that I've enjoyed learning in this process. So one of our early episodes of Immigrant Stories was Pavel Polanco Safarit, who grew up in the Dominican Republic. He's a musician, he's a jazz artist, and so we were able to tell the story of his his evolution as a musician, recording in Richmond, Indiana, this small rural community that happened to be this place that was a huge hub for jazz recording and all this kind of American roots music recording, super diverse, interracial recording sessions. Also, they recorded like early KKK productions, all for this, record company that happened to be in this tiny little town in Iowa. And so, I mean, in Indiana. So those are the kind of, there's just some of those little stories of the history of the Midwest that I think catch people off guard and make us think differently about, there's there's places, there's people and stories that have always kind of challenged the stereotype of the Midwest as this, kind of monoculture of white, um, bland sort of flat landscapes and flat culture. So I think we enjoy that as teachers, but like Josh said, I think the fun of doing that in a podcast is being able to have that person's voice come out and that person's story. And so I think that's a lot of what we hope is that listeners get just a little taste of what we're able to enjoy in the conversation, that you can hear that person's accent and feel the energy of a jazz artist or, a writer or an activist, and feel like you've got a window into a different community. Because I know for us, these conversations have led us to new people. I mean, even you, as, somebody who we've connected with through the podcast. And I mean, that would be my ultimate hope in part, is that it helps Midwesterners see the possibility of making new connections, whether it's, the actual person we've interviewed, or it gets them to think differently about people they might get to know in their own communities.
I might add just one thing real quick. So as Brian's talking, I'm thinking of three things that we hope. One, part of our audience would include my in-laws, my wife's family, which is mainly from the East Coast. And I want them to learn to respect the Midwest. That's one thing I would like to come from this series. But I also hope someone born and raised in Iowa or Minnesota might also see their own home place differently, especially with season 2. Maybe these are voices that they've seen among family at the farmer's market, but have never gotten to know them, or they know nothing about their history. So even if you've lived nowhere but Iowa, you could learn something, I think, from our series. And the third one, I think, is representation. Just like in literature or in government or whatever social organization or structure you think of, for people to be able to see themselves in our series, I think would be a goal, that we're not just privileging one voice, but that we're representing the complex spectrum that the Midwest actually is.
And from listening to a few episodes on your season 1, and I was catching up on the season 2 that you guys have, I can say that you guys are doing a great job. And I always tell Kenji, my co-producer, and I, we're just amateurs, trying to have some fun and maybe put a little bit of a conversation out there that could spark more thinking. But as I was kind of thinking about the conversation with you guys, there is this East Coast, West Coast, kind of, thing that a lot of things are happening out there, and a lot of things are happening out there. But yeah, there's a lot going on in the Midwest that I think, in my opinion, I think there's a big transition period that's happening just with immigration. For example, like I landed in 95 here in Iowa, in Perry, Iowa, a meatpacking plant. That's why we came here. My parents were making $4.25 an hour in California. And, they hear, hey, there's a $8.50 an hour job, and, that's double, 200% your salary, right? As a parent, you're like, of course, I'm going to move, But since then, things have changed. There was 9 Latino students in the high school that I went to in Perry, Iowa. And now I would dare to say that there are almost 50% Latino students in the high school. This is 95 to now, 25 some years. So where do you guys personally see Iowa changing from your perspective? How do you see it changing?
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Sure.
When you think of the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest divide,
yeah,
in Latino culture in particular, music or art or podcasts, kind of thing that you do, do you feel like those voices on the coast get amplified, that you kind of or do you feel like there is a kind of strong and sort of growing um, Latino voice here in the Midwest that you're part of, that kind of is comparable to what happens in
So
that community on the coast?
I have family. I have family in California still, and there's a thing about that. They ask us. There was a pivot at one point. I was asking them, what does it take to live out there? What's the rent and all that stuff? And then about 7, 8 years ago, that conversation started to change. Now they're interested in what does it take to live here? How much? What's the salary and all this stuff? So there's a little bit of pivot on the coolness of living in the Midwest. A lot of people are interested in what's happening here. Um, and to me, and I hope I'm answering the question, but the East Coast and West Coast, there's already something going on. Supposedly, there's a lot of going on. So here, I feel like I can make a bigger impact because it's a smaller city. Um, uh, and I think that's how I would answer that question is, um, what's happening if you go to the East Coast or the West Coast, it's more than likely already happening, or it's just too big of a place for you to make any sort of impact. Then here in Iowa, I feel like there is, because of the immigrant, we're behind the immigration wave is starting to happen here more now. So I think that there is this movement of voices of immigrant people of color, Latinos, African Americans, um, that is starting to get a little bit more momentum, and that's why it's exciting to be doing these podcasts, because there's some kind of way that's happening. I don't know really how to kind of articulate it, but it feels good. It feels exciting. My family and I, we love it here. We want to make Des Moines, be a cool place to live, hip and young, and but also still talk about serious issues, and still talk about things that can improve. So um, I hope that was. I think I maybe over answered that,
No, that's good.
um,
Thanks.
but no, I appreciate that question because there is a sense of like something's happening. It's like in the air, in the ether. You can't touch it, but hopefully we're contributing, and you guys with your podcast, um, uh, uh, I think that these are the things that people need to hear. Like people in Perry need to hear it. Uh, um, Trump land needs to hear this, and I know that I don't want to sound divisive or anything like that, but there are some people that live in a bubble, right? And if they don't listen to these stories, I think they're the ones that need to listen to the most. um, um, and I hope that maybe we can help and get those out there. And thank you guys for doing that. But what's your you threw me off guard there, Josh.
Sorry.
Well, let me just jump in there. I mean, I would say, we had been talking about stories and what we see in the Midwest. And I think the 2016 election was definitely something that a lot of people were talking about. What happened in the Midwest, and all these states that, are they blue? Are they purple? Are they red? And there was all this kind of national attention, like, oh, let's try to understand the Midwest. And I think that was definitely part of our motivation, is like, how can we tell those stories from the ground up, and try to capture what we're seeing, just all the diverse voices. And so, yeah, I think that was part of our motivation, is like Josh said, for an East Coast and West Coast audience that has this like outsider sort of fascination with the Midwest, but also, like you said, people in rural communities, people in places like Pella, where we been teaching, and just to see what's right under our noses. Because from my experience, like I lived in California, I moved here 6 years ago from Atlanta, from big city with like tons of diversity.
Mm.
But in some ways, like you're saying, because there's so many people there's so many organizations and movements and ideas, it's not always as accessible or frankly, like as kind of mixed and integrated and in the way that it is here. So one of my moments that I always go back to is like I play soccer. I play in a bunch of different adult leagues, pickup games, with these really diverse people from Perry and people, who work in really different lines of work than I do. And the leagues in Atlanta weren't like that, where all different kinds of people would just play together because there's not that many people. You got to have, because of the size of Iowa, I think there is a ton of opportunity for mixing of people who would otherwise never be in the same bubbles. And so I
Well,
think
let me
that's part of
follow.
what we're trying to capture. Yeah.
Yeah, let me follow that up. I was just thinking when we're talking bubbles, you can have a liberal bubble too, right? So it's not
Right.
just Trump land that needs to hear these stories. The most recent episode for season 2 features, a theater director, Dominique Serrand, who's won a lot of awards, won an Emmy for best regional production. I think that was I'm forgetting the year, 2018, maybe, pretty recently. Um, and one of his recent productions, Refugia, was meant to tell the kind of story we're trying to tell. I think in season 2 of refugees worldwide. It was inspired by the Syrian crisis and the whole migration across Europe of a lot of Syrian refugees. And there's this kind of really delicate balance to walk. You don't want to exoticize a foreign story, right? You don't want to take someone's pain and make it into entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, giving voice to experience and shining a light on things is important. And he and his team were just really attacked for how they did that in Refugia. They were attacked for the lack of diversity in their cast, even though they were working with a really limited budget for that production. I don't know, I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but he felt like there was another kind of bubble that just went after him.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't see really what he was trying to do with his production. And we get just in these little boxes all the time.
Yeah.
Bubbles or boxes, and we just don't listen across them
Yeah.
or outside of them. And I think that could happen on either side of that political spectrum with our series.
You're right. You're right. I'm guilty of that. I have felt, we're immigrants, right? When Trump won, there was this 6 months of depression. We were upset. Planning on moving, looking at land in Guatemala, looking at prices. I talked to my dad. My sister lives in Guatemala. We started conversations. 2 years, into the Trump presidency, that kind of, those plans kind of started to fade away. So I look back and I'm like, shoot, I wanted to leave. So there was this really strong pain, betrayed by my old high school mates. I felt betrayed, right? I'm sure they didn't feel like they were betraying me. I just felt that way. So there's this anger that was built inside. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with what I'm doing now. And I'm inevitably an immigrant, a brown person, a person of color with immigrant family. And I know I can name you 100 undocumented people that I know, like this, so it's part of my, my breathing. It's part of why I do things, a lot of the things that I do. So yeah, and then, we're saying all this stuff and we're thinking that we're pushing for something that's right. And then you kind of think about that, like, okay, am I also on that other side, right? Am I part of that problem? right? Am I creating bridges, or am I just stuck in my way? So um, uh, I think now there's another pivotal point where I think there's a little bit more of breathing room to have more conversations. And but yeah, I concur with you, Joshua. I agree with you. There is this sense, like, we can't forget that there's other sort of mentalities and ways of thinking, and why not listen instead of just saying, unless you think this way, then nothing else. So
We talked about, when we were conceiving of this season, we considered, do we include stories of, people who are sometimes, you know, categorized as, oh, this kind of anti-immigrant backlash, people who are pushing back against change in their communities.
mhm.
And I mean, we decided we really wanted to stick with the stories and the voices of immigrants, but I think we've tried to capture as much as we can. There is a lot of complexity to that. So Jean-Paul Chasang Cardenas, who I talked about before, um, he put himself through college by working in, meat packing plants in the Midwest, and, has continued to work with people who are in the agricultural sector, but, as farm workers and packing plant workers, but also building bridges with, the largely white rural communities that
Right.
are radically transformed by how that has boomed in places like Perry. And, so he talked a lot about, he worked for the governor of Iowa, Office of Latino Affairs, and trying to build bridges and in these kind of places. And, he talked about his own journey of listening and hearing the stories of rural white Iowans, and finding, things like the farm crisis in the 1980s as a point of commonality, where, the people in Central America, where he comes from, who were having to leave their farms and look for, a job in the Midwest, immigrating to the United States. Like, some of those same forces of bigger and bigger farms pushing more and more people off of their land. I mean, there's ways that I think he talked about finding that kind of common story in these rural communities in the U.S. that are, facing some of the same kind of challenges that are happening for places around the world within this global economy. And so, I think we want to try to be respectful, like you're saying, of what that looks like from the perspective of the new immigrant, but also, these small towns that are dealing with rapid changes. And
Right.
it's understandable that that's hard for people, both economically, but also culturally. And so, I think that's helpful. Like you're talking about your high school mates, how do you have those conversations still, and not just sort of give up on small town Iowans and who are maybe trying to change, but it's not in the same way that you or me would imagine.
Right. Have you guys thought about your season 3? Is there talks about that? Or where are you guys at with that?
I think season 3 might be a year out. If I think because Brian took a new job recently, we've got some transitions and we're nearing the end of our grant period. So I think we're still in search of funding and also just kind of rethinking some of that. So I think the project probably will be on hold for next year, but season 3 could be coming in maybe 2022.
Awesome.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think when we started all this, we had this long list of ways that the Midwest is evolving. So immigration was high on that list, but we imagine all sorts of other themes that we could explore. Like Josh said, our first class we taught about this was about family farms and how those have changed over time. I do a lot of work now around things like clean energy, and you can see how much Iowa and the Midwest has changed with things like wind and solar and climate change. I mean, I think we could imagine a ton of different themes that we might explore in the future, but To be determined. We'll see.
Well, one thing we might just put a plug in for, if you listen to our show on Apple Podcasts, Mid-Americana, Stories from a Changing Midwest, or if you listen on our website, www.midamericana.com, all of those numbers I think will help our case as we make some proposals for future funding. I think one thing I've learned from launching this, we've made some mistakes, and I think we could have perhaps done a little bit more work on the marketing end before launching to really make sure that our audience was a little bigger. But podcasts are really a competitive form, as you know. I mean, through over 300 new podcast series are launched every day on Apple Podcasts.
Only.
Yeah. So if you get 200 listeners per episode over a 30-day period, you're in the top 50%. But that's just not something that you can monetize or develop into a kind of self-perpetuating model. You do still need the outside support. So I think some of those aren't really sexy details, but it's part of how an art project like this continues. It has to be able to support itself.
Right. Yeah. So the website is midamericana.com. Well, I want to thank you again, Brian Campbell and Joshua Dolsall, for joining me. I will continue to listen to your production because sound-wise and production-wise and, the narration, that's like, I love that part. It reminds me a lot of to NPR stuff that they put out. So it's really great work. So we'll hopefully be looking for season 3. But thank you again, guys. Appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be talking to you soon. Maybe having a beer one day. That'd be great. Yeah, I'd like to meet you in person. I think you and Brian have chatted in person before, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yeah.
Once we get out of our little town and actually out into the world again, that'd be fun. This probably won't make it onto your show, but I would like to put in a little plug for feedback from our listeners. We don't get a lot of email, but if you go to the website, there is a form you can fill out to just send us a note. I think hearing from immigrants in particular would be really meaningful. We've had a little anecdotal input like yours that suggests that we're kind of on the right track, but I'd love to hear from more listeners about how the series spoke to them. Sounds good. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be able to edit it out and put the feedback requests, and then also Kenji and I kind of do a little outro, so we'll add the links and all that stuff. So awesome. Thank you guys for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it, and I'll let you guys know when it's all put together. Sounds awesome. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Amner.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for the time. All right.
Take care.
Bye. There you have it, Mid-Americana. Very interesting podcast. I invite everybody to go check it out. Also, we have to thank Good Vibes. Such a beautiful place. They let us use it. I mean, these guys are super welcoming every single time that we're here. So, and you like my sweater?
Yeah, I do. That's a really cool sweater.
Yeah. So
I asked.
Yes.
And you didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, no. So, well, because I wanted to tell you.
Oh, okay.
About it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Your eyes are like. No, but this sweater is from the Human Podcast. One of the podcasters that joined us a couple months ago. His name is Julian. He's the host of the Human Podcast, and he got these sweaters, like merchandise. But I fucking love it.
Where's mine?
You should get one. There's a link on his podcast. There's
a
link.
You get me one?
Yeah.
You got yourself a sweater?
Yeah.
Didn't get me one?
Yeah. But it's dope, huh? I love it. So his podcast is all about breathing, drinking water, and move the body.
That's pretty
So-
much like losing weight.
Yes.
Those are the steps of losing weight.
Yeah. No, but his approach is
Should I, like eat less?
eat less. No. No, it's a very cool podcast that it's one of the amplifiers, but I love the color. I love the whole thing about it.
Yeah, the color is really. Yeah, I like that. What is it?
It's like
a
aqua.
turquoise. It's a turquoise. Yeah, that's what it is. I like it.
Pastels. I love pastels.
Pastel. Yeah.
Mhm.
All
All right.
That's
Thank
all.
you, everybody, for listening to this episode. Thank you again to Brian and Mid Americana and Good Vibes, and we'll see you soon.